This is an Enterprise Technology Management podcast, the independent resource for IT executives.
Hello, and welcome to this podcast brought to you by Enterprise Technology Management, or ETM, a magazine and website for IT executives. Through ETM's exclusive panel podcasts, you'll hear updates, information, tips and suggestions from industry analysts and thought leaders in their fields, giving you the edge needed to succeed in the IT industry. From developing strategies to making cost-effective purchase decisions, ETM assists in managing an organization's projects via independent, world-leading research and vendor expertise. My name is Pinar Genschterk, the editor of ETM, but I'll now leave you in the capable hands of the moderator for this podcast to let them introduce themselves and the panel.
Hello and welcome to today's ETM podcast on vulnerability intelligence. I'm Scott Crawford, Managing Research Director of Security and Risk with Enterprise Management Associates, the leading IT industry analyst firm focused on IT management technologies and practices. And joining me for this discussion today are three senior experts very versed in this aspect of security management. From Qualys, we have Wolfgang Kandek, Chief Technical Officer, joining us today. Good morning, Wolfgang.
Good morning, Scott, and it's good to be with you again.
And from Secunia, we have Thomas Kristensen, Chief Security Officer and co-founder. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And from VeriSign, we're joined by Rick Howard, iDefense General Manager. Rick, hello to you.
Good morning, Scott.
Good morning. Wolfgang, let me start off by directing this question to you and your peers here. Many in our audience may be familiar with vulnerability assessment, but perhaps less so with this concept of vulnerability intelligence. What is vulnerability intelligence from your point of view, and what role do you see it playing in vulnerability management?
Sure, Scott. Well, I work at Qualys. We are a vulnerability management company, and that means we help our customers to identify vulnerabilities in their networks and to tell them about the vulnerabilities. So for us, this is the vulnerability intelligence piece where we say, we monitor the market, what's out there in terms of new vulnerabilities. We make a decision of what we think is important and what we think our customers is important to detect for, and put that into our product, and then show the data about the vulnerabilities in the typical reports that our customers pull out. So we are both users of vulnerability intelligence that we acquire and monitor, and we kind of translate into our product to make it very usable to our customers. And we actually work with Secunia and iDefense in the acquisition of that intelligence, and try to pick out the things that we think are important for our customers. They have actually a much broader view on that. So maybe, Thomas, you could chime in a little bit here on the definition of intelligence and how it is used.
Yes, definitely. The way that we view intelligence, vulnerability intelligence, is a process of gathering information about vulnerabilities in all off-the-shelf software and open source software that is on the market, then make sure we can provide that to our customers, which includes a number of different customers, both in the security industry and commercial customers, and make sure that this is as easy to understand as possible and reliable and actionable to allow the customers to go out and mitigate the vulnerabilities in their networks.
So this is Rick. I would agree with Thomas and Wolfgang on that. When we talk about intelligence at iDefense, that's another layer of context that we will give leadership. So when we provide intelligence reports on vulnerabilities, we are giving leadership information where they can make decisions and not just reporting facts or re-reporting what's in the news. So intelligence kind of takes it up another notch.
So there's an aspect of analysis clearly that's implied there, but also expertise and research that factors into what's provided both to end customers and consumers of intelligence services as well as to other security providers, which I think, Wolfgang, you gave a great illustration of that with respect to Qualys. Rick, let me ask you, considering iDefense's breadth and intelligence generally, how do you see vulnerability intelligence as being distinct from other aspects of intelligence relevant to information security?
That's a great question. Information security, as you know, is a broad field. The vulnerability piece of it, as opposed to, say, like malcode intelligence or international intelligence, things like that. Vulnerability intelligence has the unique characteristic that it is immediate and tactical, because there's such a volume of vulnerabilities that pop up in the public sphere on any given day. It takes a real machine to decide if things are important to your organization or if they're not important. And that takes real expertise to do that. That kind of intelligence that's provided by the companies from all three of these that are on this panel help decision makers get to that point at a very tactical, day-to-day operational level.
Doubtless involves an awful lot of information, just considering, first of all, the sheer nature of IT and the number of potential vulnerabilities and issues that need to be considered and addressed. Thomas, this is probably a good question for you. Given that potential overload of information, one of the biggest challenges in vulnerability management is really prioritizing not just remediation, but awareness of what the most significant aspects of vulnerability control really need to be. How does vulnerability intelligence help organizations prioritize their efforts in vulnerability management?
First of all, it gives them an overview of all the issues that affects the systems, and it tells them also what information is reliable. Granted, in this industry that we're working with vulnerabilities, there is a lot of misinformation, miscommunication out there. So you need to ensure that the information you're getting is reliable, so that you know that every single technical detail that's in it is accurate. And for that, it's important that the intelligence contains information about the technologies that are affected as accurately as possible. The customers need to know about the impacts, vectors, mitigating factors. So they need easy ways of rating this. So assessment of each individual vulnerability and ratings of it and a description of any related mitigating factors is extremely important. And by providing that in a concise way to customers and making sure that it's always reliable makes it a lot easier for them to go in and prioritize this. And in particular when they have the relation with the technology so that they can assess it related to each individual asset and the business importance that it may have.
I'd like to piggyback on that. What intelligence outfits are able to do, because we have, teams of vulnerability experts on the staff who their sole job is to assess these kinds of things day in and day out, and they have an expertise on how to do that. Most of our customers, they're not interested in creating a team of vulnerability experts. They got other more important things to do, so they can use companies like us to help them sift through that volume of information. Right, and from the Qualys perspective, I imagine, of course, as far as prioritizing the information that's made available to them, intelligence being a pretty important factor in that prioritization.
It is extremely important, and I think Rick had a great example here of the differences maybe between Qualys and iDefense. I mean, we've always put a severity on a vulnerability that helps our customers to decide what to fix first. But ultimately, there's so many vulnerabilities that you need additional factors to hone in on what's really important. So we've been working on putting more information, more of the intelligence that's being gathered into that to help the customers. But a company like VeriSign, iDefense in this case, actually has a much more personalized approach to it, takes care that they sit down with the customers directly and see of all these vulnerabilities what really applies. And then that Rick's got a couple examples of that, how that works actually quite well. But it's a very personal and intensive approach that way.
Rick, you want to share a couple of those examples?
The great example we have is that potentially if you try to patch a vulnerability out of cycle, it could cost a medium to large scale organization millions of dollars, because that's patching stuff means people have to come out, come work overtime to make sure it's done out of the normal operational issues. So if you can gather intelligence from any outfit like Secunia or iDefense or Qualys that can help you make those decisions and give you the correct answers, it could potentially save your organization millions and millions of dollars. And we've been able to do that with a number of our clients over the years.
And Thomas, this raises an issue, I think, as well, kind of coming back to my question about prioritization and making the most of the massive information that can be collected and distributed on vulnerability intelligence. How can organizations avoid this overload in ways that really do target specific guidance, specific information to aspects of the organization that are most directly affected or most relevant? I mean, is that one tactic that seems to resonate with your customers? Can you give us some examples of how your customers take advantage of how you make this sort of intelligence available?
Yes. Well, we actually do that in two different ways. We've built up two different solutions for it. One is a vulnerability intelligence distribution channel, you can say, where the customers have put in some predefined information about their infrastructure, which is then used to relate to the vulnerability intelligence that we push out to them. And this will ensure that it's the right teams within the organization that is alerted about it. They can choose different ways of being alerted, and they have different ways of tracking if they've actually dealt with it. That we found to be an extremely important factor when dealing with vulnerability intelligence, because otherwise this would end up just one place where you might not be able to address it specifically to the affected assets on the network. So it's a very important factor of delivering vulnerability intelligence to the customers. That is the relation between the intelligence and their assets. And that's an integrated part of one of our solutions. Another solution automatically identifies the different assets and then distributes this vulnerability intelligence that relates to it. And that's something that is specifically for Windows endpoints, which tend to be less systematically indexed by this central security team. So different measures are required in order to address the vulnerabilities and relate them to the specific assets.
One thing on a tactical level, one of the things we like to do is, I think Secunia and iDefense both have teams of vulnerability developers themselves. And because of their expertise, because of they're in it day to day, they can take a look at a Patch Tuesday listing of new vulnerabilities that Microsoft is fixing and can give an assessment of how easy it would be to exploit that vulnerability. This happens every month in our Patch Tuesdays reviews, where our guys could say, well, that particular one sounds really nasty, okay, but, in fact, it might take somebody, 6 to 9 months to get something working, and it may not be reliable. So maybe you don't have to do that one as fast as Microsoft recommend. So having teams of experts on the staff that can really dive in deep and get the details and give that information to your customers is pretty important.
I think there's a fair amount of awareness in the security community, at least anyway, of things like the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, for example, CVE metrics, which are fairly generalized. I don't think a lot of the community is familiar with exactly how those metrics are arrived at. Wolfgang, can you talk about how intelligence factors into that kind of information to help make the severity of vulnerabilities more understandable, more digestible to organizations?
No, absolutely. It's actually one of the things that our customers have been asking for is give me more information about the vulnerabilities. Help me to do these things automatically, some of the things that Rick just mentioned, to make that decision. I don't need to do this now. I can wait, particularly with out-of-band patching. CVSS that you mentioned has one of those components is a temporal vector. So the idea there is that the severity of the vulnerability changes over time. For example, when an exploit comes out and is available, that raises the importance of the vulnerability. If an analyst, somebody on Secunia's team or on iDefense's team makes a decision or analysis saying that it will be extremely difficult to exploit that vulnerability, that would lower that temporal vector. So these additional items in terms of intelligence can be very helpful in deciding where do you focus, what do you apply first.
And this enables your customers then to tune accordingly, right? So when they receive information from you, that can be adjusted accordingly based on additional information obtained from vulnerability intelligence.
Absolutely. So our challenge here is, or our commitment is to keep that CVSS vector updated. And in addition, we have non-CVSS related fields in our database, and you can say, show me all vulnerabilities where known exploits exist, for example, or show me vulnerabilities that have typically malware attached to them. And we're actually looking into mitigation now. So show me vulnerabilities where a third-party software might help me. So you might know there's 2 zero-day vulnerabilities out right now for Windows, one in Internet Explorer and one in the Windows component for thumbnails. And the thumbnail one is pretty well mitigated by most antivirus solutions, whereas the Internet Explorer one isn't. So in that case, that might be an interesting piece of information for the end user to say if he or she has to make a decision on what to focus on. I would say if you can only do one of those two, then work on the Internet Explorer one.
Wolfgang makes an excellent point. Mitigation is the key. All right, if your intelligence provider is not giving you mitigation options on assessment of any particular vulnerability, then they have failed you. All right, now sometimes the mitigation options can be pretty draconian because there's no patch out for a particular vulnerability, there's no third-party patch, and even the workarounds maybe don't protect you that much or severely disable a key component of your internal system. But if the intelligence provider is not at least walking you through those options, he is not helping you at all.
Right. And then, Thomas, I think probably the depth that some organizations really require in terms of intelligence does require things like malware analysis, binary analysis, things of that sort. Is this an aspect of intelligence that you can customize for Secunia customers? And how often do you find customers that are asking for more highly tailored services directed to specific groups or individuals even?
Well, when it comes to this, Secunia has taken a quite different approach to it, actually. Rather than going in and tailoring solutions to customers, we said we want to process everything that's related to off-the-shelf software and open-source software and make sure we can do that in a scalable way. And I think that's part of why the quality of what comes out of Secunia is as high as it is, and it's also the reason why we can go into depth with it. And now that you mentioned binary analysis, yes, it's something we do. We do select the vulnerabilities that we do the binary analysis of based on customer feedback, obviously, how many customers are using it, the prevalence among private users, the history for exploitation of vulnerabilities in that particular product. And that's all something that factors in where we do an in-depth binary analysis of it so that we can provide alternate mitigating strategies for the customers or give even more accurate guidance in case of where there is doubt about the exploitability of a particular vulnerability. So it's definitely something that customers, especially larger customers and governments, are requesting. But we try to scale it and make sure that it's something we can offer to all customers rather than going in and tailoring it to individual customers and their needs.
Well, I think that makes sense considering the range of exposure that organizations have from widely deployed systems. So, I think a lot of people would definitely understand that. You mentioned mitigation, and that's been an aspect of vulnerability management that has been something of a challenge for some organizations as far as this is one of those areas where creating effective processes and actually making sure that they work across security and IT operations has been a challenge. So Wolfgang, as part of the benefits of vulnerability intelligence, that also includes, as Thomas suggested, guidance on vulnerability remediation as well, too, and that's becoming more a factor for Qualys as well, it seems.
Yes, absolutely. So we're trying to include the mitigation information where possible. It has to be structured, though, because you could mitigate with an endpoint solution that it sits out on the desktop or with an IDS system that might only protect you while you're in the corporate network. And we all know that mobility is key at the moment. Many of our customers have a large portion of their users on laptops roaming basically the world, not being protected by these corporate IDS systems. They are constantly in networks that are open at hotels, coffee shops, airports, and even at home, where these protections do not kick in. So it's important to distinguish between what protection do you get when you're inside the corporation, the additional mechanisms that exist there on very smart firewalls, IDS and IPS systems, versus the ones that you can use when you're outside of the network. And I think patching is the ultimate thing that you want to do to be more robust, but we see frequently that customers have problems to keep up to date with all the patches in a timely manner.
Yeah, there's a class of vulnerabilities that some have referred to as unpatchable. And in general, what they're referring to are web applications, which are often custom developed or developed in-house by organizations, and no commercial off-the-shelf shrink-wrap software is involved, or a patch would not be available or relevant for these environments. That also highlights the unique nature of individual web applications, which can really make it difficult to identify and fix specific vulnerabilities. How does vulnerability intelligence help with managing security exposures in web applications from your point of view, Wolfgang?
Well, Scott, you said that absolutely right. Web apps is one of the new challenges or the bigger challenges that companies have. There's two divisions, known web applications, and I would put in software like blogging software, wikis, forums of that type. Those can basically be treated like normal software packages. And as Thomas mentioned, if you track that, you know there's vulnerabilities in there, you can update them. And we've added some tools that help you to track down these well-known web applications. Now, custom-made software and web applications are very difficult to analyze. You need new tools for that. And then there's typically no patch off the shelf available. So you have to talk to a developer, which opens up a whole new dimension in the fixing process. And typically we see a very slow movement there, actually.
And Thomas, from your point of view, as far as the research efforts that you're applying in order to derive the greatest benefit from intelligence for all your subscribers, how do web applications factor into your strategy?
Web applications in our strategy is very important. It's important to stress here that the only ones we're looking at and can help customers with is the ones that are shrink-wrapped, as you say, off the shelf, and the open source ones. We can't go in and do the custom-built ones because that's beyond the scope of what we're doing. But it is extremely important. There's a lot of big organizations out there who's running a lot of different web applications, and it's their image to the outside world. So they definitely do need to have this reliable, continuous flow of intelligence about web application vulnerabilities. Because the time span from the discovery of a web application vulnerability and the disclosure of it until it's starting to be exploited is very, very small, and it's easy to do a Google search, identify who's running a vulnerable version of a given web application, and start exploiting that particular organization. So it's something that we see and feel that our customers, they pay a lot of attention to, and it's something they factor in as being extremely important with the vulnerability intelligence. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, a lot of information about vulnerabilities in web applications out there is quite unreliable. So I think that's a great part of why they're so happy with the way that we're doing it, because we actually do spend a lot of resources even verifying the web application vulnerabilities, despite their prevalence being significantly smaller than the typical desktop applications you see out there.
Oh, I was just going to say, even so, in widely deployed software and even off-the-shelf and shrink-wrap software, these days, web technologies factor quite a bit into really all kinds of applications, including distributed endpoint-to-endpoint personal communications and so on. So I imagine capability in understanding web vulnerabilities is a factor regardless where it's applied, either on the server side, the client side, or in the distributed environment. Does that resonate with your customers?
Absolutely, yes.
I think you guys are hitting on something too, and also with the newly emerging application, smart mobile device application development too. You can lump that in with the web development, and this will give you some benefit if you have an intelligence organization working for you, because what Wolfgang and Thomas has said is that we don't really cover internal app development. But what we can do as an intelligence organization is monitor the field and encourage the secure software development model that people have talked about, models like the BSIM model and others that are out there. Evaluate those for our customers and recommend them so they can implement them in their own internal process. That way they correct their own vulnerabilities as they build their own applications.
Right, and that's just one aspect. From your perspective, Rick, the one thing really interesting about iDefense to me is that I do think that intelligence having value in IT security may go beyond things like disclosures of software vulnerabilities and threats per se. I think it might be really enlightening to our audience if you could elaborate on some of the other aspects of intelligence that factor into vulnerability insight, like the collection and distribution of information on factors such as, say, for example, political, strategic, economic objectives, considering cyber threats and issues, for example, corporate espionage, things like that. What are some of the factors that you've seen in those areas that have had an impact on vulnerability intelligence for IT?
That's a great question because when iDefense started some 10 years ago, we started with vulnerability intelligence and have expanded into the areas that you mentioned, Scott. And the reason is our customers needed context. These are international organizations trying to deploy their services to different kinds of people, and they need information about who is going to be attacking them, who's trying to exploit them, and that is well beyond just looking at vulnerabilities. So iDefense has expanded into, malcode reverse engineering, international reporting on the cybersecurity environment, covering such topics as how cyber warfare, how cyber terrorism, how cyber espionage all affects your business as you operate in strange environments like China, let's say, or Russia, or South America, or the Middle East. So what an intelligence office should be able to give you is context. Connect the dots. For example, there'll be some new vulnerability that we may have identified, but we can tie that to a piece of malicious code that was written by some Russian hacker who has some sort of grudge against your corporation in Moscow. So we can give you that context and give leaders that context so they can make decisions about how to protect their enterprise.
That probably raises one question I'd like to ask to each of you to close out this conversation. And Rick, given what you just described about iDefense's history, I think there's a lot of things about vulnerability intelligence that people need to know, and you probably wish that people did know. Is there any one thought in particular about vulnerability intelligence that you'd like to leave our audience with, or something that you would like to take away from this discussion or make sure that they remember when thinking about the importance of this field to their efforts?
We have a number of customers like everybody on the call, and they have a range of processes on how they deal with vulnerabilities. Right. Some customers patch immediately as they are discovered, as the vulnerabilities are discovered. Some of our customers patch within a month of it being discovered, and they have some prioritization scheme that they go through. And other customers, wait 1 year, 2 years before they patch some of these things. So when you asked that question, Scott, that's what I was laughing about. We kind of gently encourage our customers who have that 2-year cycle that they may want to reconsider their process.
Yeah, at the very least, 2 years is a pretty long window of reconsideration, all right. I think that's the least we would encourage here at EM. Thomas, from your perspective, what is it that you think people should walk away from this podcast bearing in mind about vulnerability intelligence?
That is that they should seriously consider the source of the vulnerability intelligence that they're getting, because there is such a great difference in it, and I think that too few really pay attention to the significant difference there is of the different publicly available databases and the commercial offerings within this space. We too often run into people who think that just because something has been distributed by a number of different sources that it makes it correct. Unfortunately, that is far from the way it works in this industry. There may be somewhat less than 10, maybe even closer to 5 sites that provide something that is reliable and useful. And that is very important to consider because, as we mentioned before in this podcast, there is a significant cost associated with applying mitigating factors. So you definitely don't want to go out and act on some information that has not been verified, that is inaccurate and is not actionable. So do consider it carefully, but do get some intelligence in. You do need it because it's fundamental for your security. If you do not have vulnerability intelligence, you basically don't get anything out of your other security investments.
That's a really good point. And without validation, that would be prohibitive for most organizations regardless. So services and, more importantly, the expertise behind those services, I think, would be really important for organizations to consider in handling this. And Wolfgang, given Qualys' breadth of coverage and pretty well-established footprint in vulnerability management, your thoughts on vulnerability intelligence and what you'd like our listeners to come away from this podcast with?
I would agree with Thomas. It's absolutely crucial that you get quality intelligence. And then the second component that I see as really important is that you get a good handle on the assets that you're actually managing. We see that time and again that people underestimate the number of machines that they have in their network and then automatically are blind to the state of these machines. So you need to combine the two things, knowing what's out there, knowing what's important, plus what are you actually responsible for and in what environments do these machines exist, how can they be protected the best way. And to Rick's 2-year example, that's not the way to do it. And we have pretty good examples of people that do much better, and they do not crash, they do not disable their applications all the time, and they're basically down to a 1-week patch cycle at the moment. So I think that's what any company should work towards, to apply fixes very quickly, taking into account what's important.
Yeah, that's one thing that keeps recurring over and over in our research here at EMA is not just processes and not just being reactive, but processes that actually work. And you've described the maturing world of vulnerability management very well in terms of processes that do have effect without having a negative impact on the organization. Gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this exclusive panel podcast on vulnerability intelligence. I really thank you for your time today. Thomas Kristensen, Chief Security Officer and co-founder of Secunia, thanks.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, Rick Howard with VeriSign iDefense.
Awesome. That was a great discussion.
Likewise, thank you. And Wolfgang, Chief Technical Officer at Qualys, thank you very much for joining us today.
Scott and everybody else, I had a great time here.
Likewise, thank you very much to our listeners, and we hope to have you join us again for another ETM podcast.
This brings us to the end of the exclusive panel podcast brought to you by ETM. We hope you take away some invaluable tools to help you make the right decisions for your organization. And don't forget, now that you're a member of GlobalETM.com, you can revisit this podcast at any time. We hope you visit ETM again soon.